already. I know that what's going to happen is that we are going to be building the temple in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah.
Whether by next week or
whether by next
week
week or later. I believe
there are plans to start the building of the third temple.
That very soon we will all see the building of the third temple in Jerusalem.
In September 2022, something crossed the ocean from Texas to Israel. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't money. It was 5 animals that some believe could reshape the entire religious landscape of the world. Most people had no idea this happened. There were no headlines, no viral videos, no protests, but inside religious circles, Jewish, Christian, and others, this event was treated like one of the most significant moments in decades. Why? Because these animals could unlock something that's been locked for nearly 2,000 years. What are they? Where are they now? And what happens when they reach a certain age? The answers might surprise you. For over 2 millennia, a specific group of people has been waiting for something that once seemed impossible. Not waiting passively, waiting actively, preparing, building, training, getting ready for a moment they believe is written into ancient texts and destined to happen. That moment, according to their calculations and biblical interpretations, is getting closer. Right now, in controlled facilities outside Jerusalem, 5 young red heifers are being raised under conditions stricter than most security operations. Every detail matters. Their color is monitored. Their health is checked constantly. Even a single blemish could disqualify them from their purpose. But what is their purpose exactly? To understand why people are on edge, you need to go back further than most of us ever think. You need to go back to a time when temples stood in Jerusalem, when priests performed rituals, when ancient commands were followed with precision, and when a specific ceremony involving a red heifer was considered absolutely essential. That ceremony hasn't happened in nearly 2,000 years. The last time a red heifer was sacrificed for purification, the Roman Empire was still expanding. Christianity was in its infancy. The world looked completely different. And yet, the requirement written in ancient biblical texts has never been canceled. It's never been revoked. It's just been waiting. Now, as we move deeper into 2025, something is shifting. The animals are growing. The preparations are accelerating. And religious leaders around the world are watching closely because they understand something that most mainstream news outlets haven't reported. This isn't about livestock management. This is about something much bigger. Asterisk, asterisk. The preparations being made aren't scattered or disorganized. They're precise, methodical, based on ancient instructions that have been preserved for thousands of years. And they're pointing towards something that could change geopolitics, religious practice, and how we understand biblical prophecy. The question everyone is asking is simple. Is this really happening? Or is this just a coincidence of events that people are interpreting through a religious lens? The answer might depend on what you're about to learn, because the evidence is more substantial than most people realize. The first major obstacle to rebuilding the temple has just been potentially solved. But there's a second problem that most people don't even know exists. To understand why 5 red heifers are causing such a stir, you need to understand an ancient command that most people have never heard of. It's found in the Book of Numbers, and it's one of the most specific instructions in all of religious history. Speak unto the children of Israel, that they bring thee a red heifer without spot, wherein is no blemish, and upon which never came yoke. That's Numbers 19:2. And what follows is a detailed description of a ceremony that was absolutely critical to ancient Jewish religious practice. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This wasn't metaphorical language. This was a literal instruction about a literal animal with extremely strict requirements. The heifer had to be asterisk, completely red in color. Not mostly red, completely red. A single hair of a different color could disqualify the entire animal, without blemish or defect of any kind. No broken bones. No scars, no marks, never used for labor, never had a yoke placed on it. The animal had to live a completely unburdened life. When these requirements were met, the heifer was sacrificed outside the camp. It was burned entirely. Its ashes were mixed with water. And this mixture, called the water of purification, became absolutely essential to temple worship. Here's why this matters asterisk. Anyone in ancient Israel who came into contact with death became ceremonially unclean. A dead body, a grave, even touching a bone. All of these things made a person ritually impure. And if you were ritually impure, you couldn't enter the temple. You couldn't participate in worship. You couldn't be part of the community's religious life. The only way to become clean again was through the water of purification. And the water of purification could only be made from the ashes of a red heifer that met these specific requirements. Without it, the entire temple system broke down. Priests couldn't serve, sacrifices couldn't be offered, worship couldn't function. This is why the red heifer has been such a massive obstacle for 2,000 years. After the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the practice stopped entirely, and finding a red heifer that met the biblical requirements became almost impossible. Even during the time of the First and Second Temples, when the temple was actively operating, only a handful of red heifers were ever considered acceptable. The criteria were that strict, the requirements were that demanding, and the stakes were that high. For centuries, this seemed like an impossible problem. Then something changed, something that made people believe this ancient requirement could finally be met. Imagine being part of a religious tradition where one specific ceremony is absolutely essential to your entire faith practice. Then imagine that ceremony becoming impossible to perform. Not difficult, impossible. That's what happened to Jewish practice after 70 AD. For nearly 2,000 years, religious scholars and leaders faced an unsolvable problem. The command in Numbers 19 was clear, unambiguous, non-negotiable. A red heifer with 0 defects was required, but finding one seemed like asking for a needle in a haystack. Except the haystack was the entire world, and the needle had to meet standards that were nearly impossible to achieve. The problem wasn't just scarcity, it was specificity, ***. Even one hair of a different color was disqualifying. A single physical defect meant the animal couldn't be used. Any indication that the heifer had experienced labor or worn a yoke meant starting over. The requirements weren't just strict, they were extraordinary. This created a theological paradox for religious scholars. How do you maintain a faith tradition when the most essential ceremony has become impossible? Do you abandon the requirement? Do you reinterpret it? Do you wait and hope that someday an animal will be born that meets the criteria? For centuries, the consensus was that this was simply an ancient practice that belonged to ancient history, a relic, something that would never be repeated in the modern world. Then something shifted in how people approached the problem. Instead of accepting the impossibility, some religious communities started actively looking. They studied the criteria more carefully. They examined historical records to understand what made a heifer acceptable in ancient times. They consulted with experts in breeding and genetics. And they came to a realization: it might not be impossible. It might just be difficult. It is very difficult, but not impossible. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. In the early 2020s, a ranching operation in Texas began a selective breeding program. The goal was straightforward: produce an animal that met the biblical criteria. Red heifers with no defects, animals that had never been yoked, creatures that matched the ancient requirements as closely as possible. And in 2022, they succeeded. 5 animals were identified as meeting the criteria. They were transported to Israel. They were placed in controlled facilities. And the watch began. For the first time in 2,000 years, the impossible problem might have a solution. But success creates a new problem that's even more complex. September 2022 marked a turning point that almost nobody noticed. 5 red heifers arrived in Israel from a ranch in Texas. The transportation wasn't secret, but it wasn't publicized either. It happened quietly, methodically, like a significant historical event that was simultaneously being kept low-key. These weren't ordinary cattle being transported for commercial purposes. Every aspect of their care was planned with precision. The conditions of their environment were controlled. Their diet was monitored. Their health was checked constantly. Even their stress levels were considered important factors. Why such extreme care? Because any defect could appear at any time. An animal that looked perfect today might develop a blemish tomorrow. A hair could change color. A physical problem could emerge. The requirements were so strict that constant vigilance was absolutely necessary. The animals were placed in a secure facility near Jerusalem. Access was restricted. The conditions were optimized. Documentation of every detail was maintained. And a team of experts, veterinarians, religious scholars, and specialists in biblical law oversaw everything. This wasn't being done in secret. Religious communities around the world knew it was happening, but the mainstream media largely ignored it. Why? Because it seemed obscure, irrelevant to most people's daily lives. A curious religious practice that had minimal impact on the broader world. But inside religious circles, the significance was impossible to overstate. For the first time in 2,000 years, the path to temple purification was potentially open. And if purification was possible, then other things became possible too. Things that religious scholars had been preparing for in other ways. Things that seemed impossible just years earlier. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem, for instance, had been working for decades on projects that would only make sense if a temple was actually going to be rebuilt. They had recreated priestly garments based on ancient descriptions. They had crafted temple vessels, menorahs, altars, tables, with meticulous attention to biblical specifications. Why spend decades and enormous resources on these projects if you didn't believe they would eventually be used? The answer suggested something that most people weren't prepared to consider. Some people genuinely believed that a third temple was coming, and they were preparing for it. The red heifers weren't just animals. They were a catalyst, the final piece that made everything else possible. As 2025 approaches, these heifers are reaching a critical age. When they do, a decision will need to be made, a decision that could trigger events that reshape the entire region. In a building in the old city of Jerusalem, something remarkable has been happening for decades. It's not widely known. It's not heavily advertised, but it represents one of the most extraordinary preparations in modern religious history. The Temple Institute began its work with a clear vision. If a temple is going to be rebuilt, what would be needed? Not just the structure itself, but everything inside it, everything required for it to function. So they started building, and they haven't stopped. Asterisk, asterisk. Using ancient biblical descriptions as blueprints, they recreated the priestly garments. These weren't costumes. They were reconstructions based on detailed specifications from ancient texts. The ephod, the breastplate, the turban, each piece was crafted according to biblical instructions that had been preserved for thousands of years. They didn't rush. They studied. They consulted with experts. They examined historical records and archaeological findings. And they built with precision. Then they moved on to the temple vessels. The golden menorah, a 7-branched candelabra described in exquisite detail in ancient texts. They built it. The altar of incense, the table of showbread, the trumpets and musical instruments used in temple worship. One by one, these items were reconstructed. Priests from the tribe of Levi were identified. These weren't just any priests. According to Jewish tradition, the priestly line descends from Aaron, the brother of Moses. Identifying individuals with documented genealogical connections to this lineage and training them for temple service was part of the preparation. Musical training, ritual procedures, ancient ceremonies, all of it was being studied, documented, and practiced. This is the level of detail we're talking about. And remarkably, the person leading much of this work has stated clearly, we're not building these things because we're hopeful. We're building these things because we believe this is happening. This is inevitable. That's an extraordinary statement. It suggests a conviction that goes beyond optimism. It suggests certainty. The question is, what would give someone that level of certainty? What would make them spend decades, resources, and energy preparing for something that most people consider impossible? The answer appears to be this: the red heifer. As long as the red heifer problem was unsolvable, the entire project was theoretical. It was academic. It was preparation for something that couldn't actually happen. But once the red heifer problem had a potential solution, everything changed. The preparations aren't random or symbolic. They're functional. They're designed to work. And according to religious scholars, we're closer to the moment of activation than most people realize. This is where the narrative intersects with something that has fascinated religious scholars and archaeologists for centuries: biblical prophecy. The prophet Ezekiel lived during the Babylonian exile, around 2,600 years ago. He described a vision, detailed, precise, filled with measurements and specific instructions, of a temple unlike any that had been built before. In the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel, and set me upon a very high mountain by which was the frame of a city on the south. That's Ezekiel 40 verse 2. And what follows is chapter after chapter of exact measurements, architectural details, and descriptions of temple rituals. Scholars have debated for centuries. Was this a historical description of an existing temple? Was it metaphorical or symbolic? Or was it a prophecy, a vision of something that would happen in the future? Many contemporary scholars believe it's a prophecy, and not metaphorical prophecy. But literal prophecy describes a real structure that would be built at a specific time in human history. If that's true, then what's happening right now takes on extraordinary significance. The red heifer preparations, the recreated temple vessels, the trained priests, the decades of planning. These aren't just religious hobbyists pursuing an obscure tradition. These might be people who understand something about the timeline of history, about what's coming, about what's inevitable. But there's another layer to this. Jesus himself referenced a future temple. In the Gospel of Matthew, he speaks of a moment when the abomination of desolation will stand in the holy place. This wasn't describing something in the past. It was describing something in the future, and it assumed the existence of a functioning holy place. For such a place to exist and be functioning, it would need to be rebuilt. And before it could function, according to biblical law, purification would be required. Once again, the red heifer stands at the center of the narrative. What's striking about these developments is how they align with ancient prophecy, not because people are forcing connections that don't exist, but because the preparations themselves are based on ancient instructions. And when you follow ancient instructions precisely, you naturally align with ancient prophecies about what would happen when those instructions were followed. Religious scholars on multiple continents have noticed these connections. Some believe we're approaching a prophesied moment. Others think it's a coincidence. But the timing is raising questions that demand answers. Here's what most news outlets aren't discussing. The geopolitical implications of this situation are enormous. The Al-Aqsa Mosque currently stands on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It's one of Islam's holiest sites. It has stood there for approximately 1,400 years. For many Muslims around the world, this mosque represents something deeply sacred and irreplaceable. Now imagine, a significant movement in Israel declares an intention to rebuild a Jewish temple on the same location. To do so would require removing or relocating the mosque. To Muslims worldwide, this would be catastrophic. To Jews who believe the temple must be rebuilt, it's a matter of religious necessity. This is the core conflict, and it's not theoretical. In recent months, tensions have escalated around the Temple Mount. Extremist groups have announced plans to attempt entry. Israeli security forces have been positioned. International observers have watched with concern. The arrival of the red heifers didn't cause this conflict, but it has intensified it, because it represents the possibility that this theological dispute might actually become a practical reality. Religious leaders, political analysts, and security experts around the world are paying attention, because the intersection of religious conviction and geopolitical reality can create unpredictable situations. The red heifers represent a symbol of these tensions. To some people, they represent the fulfillment of prophecy and the restoration of their ancient faith. To others, they represent a threat to their own sacred sites and religious identity. And the animals are growing. They're approaching the age where they could be used. They're passing health inspections. There are no obvious defects emerging. As that moment approaches, tensions are likely to increase. Not because the animals themselves are dangerous, but because what they represent is so significant to so many people. This is why people are on edge. It's not panic. It's not hysteria. It's a realistic understanding that significant religious and geopolitical events are potentially approaching. Events that could reshape the Middle East. Events that could affect millions of people. The red heifers are just animals, but they carry symbolic weight that's almost impossible to overstate. The moment these animals reach sacrificial age, a chain of events could begin that's impossible to stop. And that moment is coming sooner than most people realize. Beyond the geopolitical dimension, there's a spiritual framework that helps explain why religious people are so focused on these developments. Christian theology has long understood the temple sacrifices through a specific lens. According to Christian teaching, Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice. His death and resurrection fulfilled and superseded all the temple requirements that came before. But here's where it gets interesting. Christian scholars note that the red heifer sacrifice is described in the book of Hebrews in a way that directly connects it to Christ's sacrifice. For if the blood of bulls and of goats, and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean, sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? That's Hebrews 9 verses 13 to 14. The comparison is explicit. The red heifer purified the outward body. Jesus purifies the inner conscience. But there's more. The red heifer had to be without blemish, perfect, without defects. Jesus, according to Christian theology, was without sin, perfect, without moral defect. The red heifer was rare. Only a handful throughout all of history were deemed acceptable. Jesus was unique. One person, irreplaceable. From a Christian perspective, the appearance of acceptable red heifers carries prophetic significance. It's not that Christians want a temple rebuilt. Most Christian theology doesn't require it, but the symbolic weight is meaningful. It represents a moment when ancient requirements are being fulfilled, when things that seemed impossible are becoming possible. For Jewish believers, the interpretation is different but equally significant. The temple represents restoration, the return to a way of practicing faith that was interrupted by exile and destruction. The red heifer represents the pathway back, the key that unlocks what has been locked for 2,000 years. It's about continuity, about connection to ancient tradition, about the belief that what was broken can be restored. Both perspectives, Christian and Jewish, see significance in what's happening. And for other religious communities, the implications are different again. Some see it as a fulfillment of prophecy. Some see it as a threat to their own sacred spaces and traditions. Some see it as a fascinating historical moment that bridges ancient and modern times. The common thread is this: people recognize that something significant is happening. Whether they view it as positive, negative, or simply inevitable, there's an acknowledgement that the arrival of acceptable red heifers changes the equation. It moves something from the realm of impossible dreams to the realm of practical possibility. As we move into the final stretch of this story, the question becomes unavoidable: what happens next? And are we truly prepared for the answer? Let's talk about timing, because timing matters in this narrative. The red heifers arrived in Israel in September 2022. They were young animals then, calves, essentially. For the past 2.5 years, they've been raised, monitored, and cared for under strict conditions. According to biblical law, a red heifer must reach a minimum age of 3 years before it can be sacrificed. That means we're approaching a critical moment. In the coming months of 2025, these animals will reach that threshold. When they do, a decision point arrives. The animals will be examined by experts in Jewish law. They'll be inspected for any defects. Their color will be verified. Their history will be confirmed, and a determination will be made. Does this heifer meet the biblical requirements, or does it not? If even one of the 5 heifers is deemed acceptable, the process can move forward. And here's what that process looks like. First, a location outside the Temple Mount will be selected. According to biblical law, the ceremony cannot take place on the Temple Mount itself. It must be performed in a ritually pure location outside the city. Second, a priest from the lineage of Aaron will be prepared. This isn't just any priest. This is someone with documented genealogical connection to Aaron's line. They will undergo ritual purification and preparation for the ceremony. Third, the ceremony will be performed. The heifer will be sacrificed. It will be burned completely. The ashes will be carefully collected and preserved. And for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, the water of purification will be made. What happens after that? According to those preparing for this moment, everything changes. Because with purification available, the final obstacles to temple service are removed. Priests can be purified. The path to temple worship becomes theoretically possible. This doesn't mean a temple will be built immediately. That's important to understand. But it removes a critical barrier. It opens a door that's been closed for 2 millennia. And once a door is open, possibilities emerge that were previously impossible. Religious scholars and analysts are watching these timelines carefully. Some believe we're approaching a historical inflection point, a moment when things that have been theoretical for centuries become practical reality. The animals are growing. The preparations are complete. The timeline is accelerating, asterisk asterisk, and the world is largely unaware of what's approaching. The moment is coming. The decision will be made. And when it is, the consequences will ripple outward in ways that nobody can fully predict. What we're witnessing is remarkable precisely because it's happening quietly. There are no grand announcements, no worldwide media coverage, no dramatic ceremonies, just steady, methodical preparation. Animals growing in controlled facilities. Religious scholars studying ancient texts. Preparations were made for a moment that many people didn't believe would ever arrive. But it's arriving. The red heifers in Israel are not just animals. They're symbols of something much larger. They represent the collision between ancient prophecy and modern reality. They represent the possibility that things we thought were impossible might actually be inevitable. For Jewish believers, this moment represents restoration and the renewal of ancient practice. For Christian believers, it represents a fulfillment of prophecy and a sign of how history is unfolding according to ancient texts. For others around the world, it represents either hope or concern, depending on their perspective and their stakes in the situation. What's undeniable is this: preparations that once seemed impossible are now complete. The temple vessels are built, the priestly garments are crafted, the priests are trained, the ceremonial knowledge has been preserved and studied, and the final missing piece, the red heifer, has arrived. As we move forward into 2025 and beyond, the timeline accelerates. The animals reach maturity, decisions are made, ceremonies potentially begin, and consequences flow outward. Will a third temple actually be built? That's a question scholars debate. Some believe it's inevitable. Others believe it's symbolic or spiritual rather than literal. Others believe the timeline extends far into the future. But what's clear is this: the preparations being made are not speculative. They're based on ancient instructions that have been carefully preserved. They're being conducted by people who genuinely believe in their purpose and their outcome. The question now is simple: are we watching history unfold before our eyes? Or are we watching a fascinating religious movement that will ultimately fade into obscurity? The answer might depend on what happens in the coming months. As the red heifers reach their critical age, as the examinations take place, as decisions are made about whether they meet the requirements, as the timeline progresses from possibility toward reality. What we're witnessing is a moment where ancient prophecy and modern events align in ways that demand our attention, not with fear or panic, but with awareness, with understanding that significant things are happening, that the world is more complex and more connected to ancient history than most people realize, and that sometimes the most important events happen not with fanfare, but quietly, methodically, inevitably. The watch continues, the timeline progresses, and the moment approaches.